The chains had been silver once, before generations of use wore them dull as weathered pewter. Nora Ashford watched as they wrapped around her wrists for what she knew would be the last time, one way or another. The metal was cold against her skin, colder than the drafty ceremony hall warranted, cold in the way enchanted things were cold when they touched human flesh and remembered their purpose was to constrain, to bind, to hold fast against struggle and protest and desperate pleas for mercy that no one in this chamber would ever hear or acknowledge or remember once the ceremonial doors closed behind them. She had stood in this binding circle 3 times before, each time marking another milestone in her transformation from grieving child to valuable property. The first time at 12, still numb from her mother's funeral while bureaucrats in expensive robes explained with practiced sympathy that debts transferred through bloodlines like family heirlooms, that her mother's obligations had become hers the moment Nora Ashford's heart stopped beating. The second time, at 15, when the Seer Council realized her prophetic visions were manifesting stronger and clearer than they'd dared hope, and decided she was old enough to be profitable to men with money and political ambitions who paid premium prices for glimpses of futures not yet set in stone. The third time at 17, when they finally understood her gift was not only powerful, but disturbingly accurate in ways that made her simultaneously valuable and dangerous, a combination that kept powerful people awake at night, weighing potential profits against potential threats to their carefully constructed plans. Each time the ceremony repeated, the chains had felt heavier. Each time she had walked out of this ancient hall belonging to someone new, her contract passed from hand to hand like currency at market, her future determined by signatures and wax seals while she stood silent in a circle carved with binding runes that glowed faint red whenever magic touched them, whenever blood was spilled in oath-taking, whenever promises were sworn that would reshape lives without bothering to ask permission first from the people whose lives were being reshaped. This time felt different from all the others, though Nora couldn't have explained why if someone had pressed her for details. The air itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation, waiting for something that hadn't arrived yet but was already changing the fundamental shape of what would come after. She could feel it in her bones, in the crescent-shaped mark on her left palm that she kept carefully wrapped in strips of cloth, in the peculiar weight of inevitability that always settled over moments right before they shattered into something else entirely. It was the same feeling she got in the seconds before major visions struck, that sense of the world holding perfectly still right before reality decided to show her things she desperately didn't want to see, futures she couldn't prevent, and deaths she was powerless to stop, no matter how clearly she saw them coming. High Seer Cassia stood before the ceremonial altar in white robes so pristine they seemed to emit their own internal glow in the candlelight, each fold and drape arranged with such perfection that it suggested hours of careful work by servants who knew their positions depended on making their mistress look flawless. The council chamber itself was built specifically to impress and intimidate in equal measure, a calculated exercise in architectural dominance designed to remind visitors exactly who held power in this kingdom. Black marble walls veined with silver ore that caught firelight and reflected it back in shifting patterns that almost formed comprehensible words. If you stared long enough, if you let your eyes lose focus just right, if you were foolish enough to try reading messages in metallic reflections that probably weren't meant for human eyes in the first place. The vaulted ceiling disappeared into shadow far above their heads, though Nora knew from previous visits that intricate star maps covered the darkness up there, ancient constellations painstakingly painted by artists long dead, tracking the movements of celestial bodies and the prophecies connected to their positions. Maps showing futures that had already happened or been prevented depending on who you asked and how they counted success versus failure in the eternal war between fate and free will that had consumed philosophers and mages for centuries, without ever producing a definitive answer that satisfied anyone completely. The hall smelled of incense burning in elaborate bronze thuribles that hung from chains attached to ceiling beams, the sweet smoke scent carefully calculated to mask older and less pleasant aromas that had seeped deep into the stones over decades of ritual work performed by people who didn't always survive the experience of beeswax melted and reformed thousands of times. pooled around candles that burned day and night in their brackets, without anyone ever explaining why the flames needed to be eternal. Of iron from the chains themselves, metal that had touched so much human skin over the years, it carried the memory of fear and resignation. Of rain falling through the open skylights that let moonlight pierce the gloom in silver shafts that never quite managed to reach all the way down to the floor, where shadows gathered thick as fog. And beneath everything else, threading through all the other scents like a bass note underlying a melody, that particular copper edge that clung stubbornly to places where magic and mortality had intersected too often for too long, where too much blood had been spilled over ceremonial purposes that never quite seemed to justify the cost when examined in the cold light of day by people who hadn't been present for the rituals and didn't understand why. Tradition demanded such high prices for maintaining order and preserving power structures that benefited some people considerably more than others. Behind Cassia's position at the altar, 4 other council members occupied massive stone seats that had been carved directly into the wall centuries ago, like thrones meant for minor gods who had been promised divinity but never quite achieved it. Their faces were carefully neutral in that practiced way powerful people's faces went neutral when they were about to do something morally questionable, when they needed plausible deniability more than they needed honest acknowledgement of their actions. Nora recognized 2 of them from previous encounters that still featured prominently in her nightmares whenever she managed to sleep long enough to dream. High Inquisitor Darius, who had conducted her initial gift certification ceremony when she was only 12 years old, barely a month after her mother died, and deemed her suitable for binding despite her obvious terror and the fact that she could barely speak through tears. A thin man with iron-gray hair and eyes like chips of flint, who approached human suffering with the detached curiosity of a naturalist studying insects under glass. He had made her demonstrate her visions 3 times that day, forcing her to watch her mother die over and over in prophetic memory until she vomited from the emotional strain. And then he'd noted her reactions in his leather journal with clinical precision before signing the certification paperwork that sealed her fate. Beside him sat Keeper of Records Meredith, an older woman who maintained the official logs of every Seer contract in the kingdom, who probably knew more dangerous secrets than anyone currently breathing, secrets locked inside her head, and her carefully encrypted files where they could be retrieved whenever leverage was needed against someone who had grown too comfortable or too rebellious. She rarely spoke during ceremonies, but her presence alone was enough to make most people nervous because everyone knew she remembered everything, forgot nothing, and kept detailed records that could destroy reputations or end careers with a single whispered revelation to the right listener at the right moment. To Cassia's left stood Lord Merrick, the merchant who had purchased Nora's contract 3 years ago from her mother's estate for what he'd considered a bargain price, and who had apparently grown tired of owning a seer who stubbornly refused to make him richer at the expense of her conscience and other people's survival. He was round-faced and perpetually sweating despite the chamber's chill. His expensive coat of imported silk stretched tight across a stomach that spoke eloquently of too many rich meals, and too few concerns about where the food came from, or who went hungry to subsidize his excessive consumption. His small eyes were constantly calculating, measuring human value exclusively in terms of profit margins and investment returns, finding most people severely wanting according to his personal arithmetic of worth. To Cassia's right stood an empty space, carefully marked on the floor with fresh chalk and protective sigils drawn that very morning, according to protocols established before anyone in this room had been born, where the new contract holder would stand once the binding ceremony completed its appointed course. That designated space seemed somehow larger than its actual dimensions, darker than simple geometry allowed, as if something about this particular contract transfer made even the ancient stones nervous in ways they usually reserved for executions and natural disasters, and moments when the fundamental order of things was about to shift beneath everyone's feet. Nora kept her breathing steady and her eyes focused forward, a survival skill learned through too many hours of being examined like livestock at market, assessed for value and found either sufficient or wanting, depending on what the examiner needed accomplished that particular day. She had discovered early in her servitude that showing fear in the council hall was like bleeding in water full of hungry sharks, like announcing vulnerability to predators whose entire existence depended on identifying and exploiting weakness wherever they found it. The people who held power in this chamber could smell terror across dimensions, and they had refined the art of exploitation into something approaching high culture over generations of practice, something they taught to their children from birth and perfected over lifetimes, spent crushing others beneath their ambitions. Nora Ashford, High Seer Cassia, began in a voice that carried the particular resonance that came from decades of speaking words deliberately crafted to bend reality to match syntax, from shaping raw air and focused intention into forms that took on physical weight and measurable consequence in the world. Each syllable she pronounced landed with precision, with carefully calculated impact, with the kind of controlled power that made younger mages study elocution and voice projection the way soldiers studied swordwork, understanding on an instinctive level that properly wielded voice could be weapon as surely as any forged blade. Born under the fractured moon in the year of the Red Comet, marked by the prophetic gift through maternal bloodline passed down through 4 documented generations of talented seers, bearing the accumulated debts of your lineage, both material and spiritual in nature, you are hereby called forth to answer the bonds that currently bind you and will continue to bind you until such time as those debts are fully satisfied through service faithfully rendered, contract obligations met to stated specifications, or death intervenes to void all earthly obligations as is customary and proper under laws established by ancient precedent and refined through centuries of judicial interpretation. The elaborate formal language made Nora's teeth ache in ways that had nothing whatsoever to do with ambient temperature or physical discomfort. There was genuine power woven through those carefully chosen words, power that resided in phrases worn smooth by centuries of ritual repetition, in legal formulas that had been refined through countless generations of scholars and practitioners of binding magic, who understood that specificity and precision mattered far more than poetry or elegance when you were attempting to constrain human will and reshape destiny according to contracts, written by people who would never face the consequences of their own carefully worded clauses. The debt originally incurred by Nora Ashford in payment for emergency magical services rendered during the plague years, when her visions helped identify the disease's source and probable spread patterns, Cassia continued, pulling an ancient scroll from the depths of her voluminous robes with the kind of theatrical timing that suggested decades of ceremonial practice and careful study of dramatic effect, and subsequently transferred upon her untimely death to her sole surviving heir, as is both customary practice and legally mandated under Article 7 of the Seer binding protocols established in the reign of King Alaric III, now stands at a total of 7 years, 6 months, and 43 days of contracted service yet to be satisfactorily completed, according to standards outlined in the original documentation. She paused for effect, letting that number sink in, letting everyone present understand exactly how much of Nora's life had been claimed by circumstances completely beyond her control. Lord Merrick, who purchased said contract from the Ashford estate 3 years prior, at publicly recorded rates that met all regulatory requirements for such transactions, has formally reviewed the terms of his acquisition and has declared through properly filed documentation that the bound Seer's service has been materially unsatisfactory according to performance standards explicitly established in the documentation of line Seers of the comment or bound comment, original binding agreement, and subsequently reaffirmed through amendments added during the contract transfer process. The Council has thoroughly and carefully reviewed Lord Merrick's submitted claim of contractual breach, has examined in detail all supporting documentation he provided, including testimony from multiple witnesses, has interviewed relevant parties regarding the Seer's conduct and demonstrated capabilities, and finds substantial merit in his grievance as presented to this body. Cassia's voice took on additional weight, additional formality, as she pronounced what everyone in the chamber had been expecting. Therefore, under the full authority vested in this council by royal charter, granted 200 years ago, and reinforced by ancient traditions stretching back to the kingdom's founding, the contract between Lord Merrick and the seer Nora Ashford is hereby formally dissolved with immediate effect. The underlying debt, however, being legally separate from any individual contract of service, remains entirely unaffected by this dissolution, and continues to require satisfaction through appropriate means, as determined by whoever assumes responsibility for collecting said outstanding obligation. Nora's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, her back teeth grinding together behind the neutral expression she had perfected through years of practice and necessity. Unsatisfactory service. That was certainly one way to phrase what had actually transpired between them. A convenient reduction of complex ethical decisions and moral stands into simple contractual language that erased all context and nuance from situations that deserved better than bureaucratic categorization. What Lord Merrick had actually wanted from her, what he had demanded with increasing anger and threats of punishment, was for her to use her prophetic visions to predict commodity prices before market movements occurred, agricultural yields before harvest season arrived. The outcomes of delicate political negotiations before they were publicly announced, any information that could be exploited for massive financial gain if you possessed advanced knowledge and had absolutely no ethical concerns about the human cost of your trading strategies or the suffering your profit-seeking would inevitably cause to people who couldn't protect themselves from market manipulation. She had refused his orders consistently because her gift showed her in excruciating detail that following his instructions would directly result in farmers losing ancestral lands when crops failed and they couldn't secure emergency loans at reasonable rates, workers starving in urban slums because grain prices were being artificially manipulated by wealthy speculators with insider information, entire extended families destroyed and scattered because one man with inherited money wanted to add more gold to coffers already overflowing with wealth he couldn't possibly spend in 3 lifetimes, even if he developed suddenly expensive tastes and decided to buy everything he saw. Apparently, having principles strong enough to resist direct orders from your legal owner, having ethics that you refused to compromise even under threat of punishment, was considered sufficient grounds for contract termination in the current legal framework that governed Seer bindings. A new contract has been proposed through proper bureaucratic channels, Cassia announced, and something in her carefully controlled voice shifted subtly, changed in ways that made Nora's finely honed survival instincts recognize this was the moment everything had been building toward, the reveal that would explain why this ceremony felt different from all her previous transfers. The Crown has submitted a formal request for transfer of contractual obligations, accompanied by the requisite binding fees calculated according to standard formulae established by the Council's Financial Committee and surety deposits, more than sufficient to guarantee fulfillment of terms should unforeseen circumstances change the arrangement. The proposed transfer has been reviewed by all appropriate council committees following established protocols and has been deemed acceptable under existing regulations governing such arrangements between private contractors and Royal Anticonatine Authority. The single word hung in the suddenly still air like smoke rising from ceremonial censers, thick and choking and absolutely impossible to ignore, no matter how much everyone might wish to look away. Crown. Nora's carefully maintained pulse quickened, despite her absolute best efforts to remain outwardly calm and impassive, to give nothing away that could be used against her later. The Crown didn't request Seers through normal bureaucratic channels like common merchants hiring servants. The Crown took gifted prophets when strategic governmental needs required their talents, used them ruthlessly and without mercy until they broke completely under accumulated mental strain, then quietly discarded them when their minds finally shattered beneath the unbearable weight of too many possible futures, pressing relentlessly against too few present moments. Too many branching timelines crushing consciousness until prophets couldn't tell present from future anymore and went mad from the confusion. The massive doors at the far end of the ceremonial hall opened without making any sound at all. Those enormous oak panels that should have creaked on ancient iron hinges, swinging smoothly inward, as if recently oiled or enchanted to move in silence. Every single person assembled in the chamber felt the fundamental change before they heard anything, before they saw actual movement in the doorway, before their eyes confirmed what their instincts were already screaming. A shift in atmospheric pressure that made ears pop slightly, a change in the very quality of air itself, as if someone had opened an unexpected door between worlds and let something vast and patient and very old flow through the gap into their reality. The kind of overwhelming presence that made even candle flames lean noticeably away, tilting against invisible currents of power. As if fire itself recognized something far more ancient and infinitely more dangerous than simple combustion currently walking among them. King Alaric Thorn entered the council chamber completely alone, and that single fact by itself was remarkable enough to send visible ripples of surprise and speculation through the assembled witnesses, like wind moving through fields of grain ready for harvest. No royal guards flanking him in ceremonial armor polished to mirror brightness specifically for formal occasions. No trusted advisors trailing exactly 3 respectful steps behind, with leather document cases and carefully prepared diplomatic suggestions for every contingency. No herald announcing his arrival with brass trumpets and the recitation of formal titles that would take several minutes to pronounce properly. He simply walked through those ancient doors with calm confidence, as if he owned them, which he did by legal right and historical precedent, along with the hall itself and the city surrounding it, and essentially everything else that lay between the northern mountains and the southern sea, according to maps that defined his kingdom's territorial boundaries. His cloak was the exact color of midnight sky when heavy clouds obscured all starlight. Black fabric so deep and pure it seemed to absorb and consume light, rather than merely reflecting it back to observers' eyes. Fastened at the throat with an ornate silver clasp shaped like a raven's skull, with tiny garnets set into the eye sockets that caught firelight and glowed like embers. Underneath the dramatic cloak, he wore dark gray wool tailored in a cut that suggested formal courtwear suitable for ceremonies, but maintained enough practical simplicity to allow actual unrestricted movement, to permit drawing weapons quickly if circumstances suddenly required defensive action. His hair was black as the cloak he wore over his shoulders, cut short in an efficient military style that clearly prioritized function and practicality over current fashion trends or aristocratic affectation. His face was constructed entirely of angles and severity, all sharp cheekbones that cast their own shadows even in bright light, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from solid granite by a sculptor who believed that true masculine beauty came from strength and determination rather than softness or conventional prettiness. But it was his eyes that made Nora forget momentarily how to perform the basic automatic function of breathing properly. They weren't black as the popular songs and frightened rumors consistently claimed. They were gray, the exact precise color of winter storms rolling in over the northern sea in the deep cold months when sky and water became functionally indistinguishable from each other. The color of high-quality iron before it's tempered in forge fire. The color of that peculiar moment just before dawn breaks when accumulated darkness finally acknowledges that approaching light is inevitable. And those storm-colored eyes moved through the crowded chamber with focused, systematic attention, cataloging potential threats with practiced precision. They passed over the council members with casual indifference, bordering very close to outright contempt. Passed over Cassia with something that might have been strategic assessment or complete dismissal. Passed over Merrick with such obvious open contempt that the merchant physically flinched. Then settled directly on Nora with focused intensity that made her want desperately to step backward despite the enchanted chains holding her firmly in place. The crescent-shaped mark on her left palm suddenly burned with heat that had absolutely nothing to do with ambient temperature and everything to do with proximity to something her prophetic gift recognized as critically, fundamentally important. Oh no, not here, not now, but prophecy had never once cared about human wishes for convenience. The vision slammed into her consciousness, pulling her completely out of the present moment and hurling her sideways through time into a future that felt too certain, too close, too absolutely inevitable. Blood spreading across pale throne room marble in expanding pools. A crown lying shattered on the floor. Precious gold bent at physically impossible angles and rare gems scattered. 7 bells ringing in the distinctive pattern that traditionally marked royal death. A solitary figure standing precisely at the boundary between firelight and absolute consuming darkness. And stretching beyond him an absence so complete, it felt like falling directly into the infinite void. The taste of copper strong on her tongue, the sound of something vast finally losing its patience. And at the center of every fragmentary vision, the man currently standing mere 20 feet away, bleeding out his life on throne room marble, while animated shadows crawled across his face like living creatures, flowing into his dying eyes, systematically consuming all the light inside him until nothing remained but empty darkness, wearing the hollow shape of a dead king. Nora came back to herself with a sharp, involuntary gasp she barely managed to strangle silent. Her knees wanted desperately to buckle. The silver chains clinked softly as her hands trembled visibly. King Alaric's storm-gray eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He was definitely paying attention, and he had noticed absolutely everything about her reaction. "Your Majesty," Cassia recovered quickly. "We were not informed you would attend personally. The usual protocol involves an appointed representative." "I don't care about usual protocol," King Alaric interrupted with calm authority, his voice low and controlled in ways that paradoxically made people lean forward to hear properly. "I care exclusively about results. Lord Merrick has made certain specific claims about this seer. I want direct personal confirmation whether those claims are accurate or whether they reflect his disappointment that she won't help him exploit vulnerable people." His gaze shifted to Lord Merrick. "Well, are you claiming the seer's visions are factually inaccurate? Or are you claiming she won't use a perfectly functional gift in ways you find profitable?" Merrick stammered for several seconds before managing words. "Your Majesty, the girl has proven herself willfully disobedient on multiple documented occasions. She repeatedly claims her visions are unclear when her accuracy rating is among the Council's highest. She refuses legitimate commercial applications, citing absurd ethical concerns. You wanted her to predict which farms would fail so you could buy their land at distressed prices before owners realized crops were dying," Alaric interrupted with edges sharp enough to draw blood. "That's not legitimate commerce, that's vulture work. The question," Alaric continued, returning attention to Nora, "is whether her refusal stems from inability or principles. One is a flaw, the other is valuable." He began circling the binding circle slowly, studying her with focused attention. Nora kept chin up, though her heart hammered audibly. The king moved with remarkable quietness, taller than she'd realized, broader through shoulders, thin scar along his jaw, another on his left hand from a blade. "You refuse to predict crop yields for Merrick," Alaric stated when he stopped before her. "I refused," Nora confirmed. "Why?" "Because he wanted to know which fields would fail earliest, which landowners were vulnerable, then buy land at distressed prices. My gift isn't meant to help wealthy men profit from others' desperation." Cassia made a sharp sound. "The girl doesn't understand complex economics." "The girl," Alaric said with quiet menace that dropped the temperature, "understands ethics perfectly well, which is more than I can say for most people breathing in this chamber." He stopped directly before Nora, close enough that she could see gray shades flecked darker and lighter like layered storm clouds, close enough to smell cedar and smoke, close enough that when her mark burned hotter, the prophetic vision felt intimate. Same throne room, same blood, but this time the moment before impact, him turning towards something between shadow and substance, hand moving to sword but not fast enough, the blade opening him shoulder to sternum, him falling. Nora's breath hitched. Alaric's expression shifted. "You saw something." "Yes," Nora whispered. "Something about me." "Yes." "Something bad." She nodded once. Alaric studied her intently, then turned sharply to Cassia. "The binding contract." "Now," Cassia hesitated. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should discuss terms." "Now," Alaric said with absolute finality. Cassia spread parchment across the altar. Alaric scanned it, then pulled a knife and sliced his palm. Blood welled. He pressed his bleeding hand against parchment. When he lifted it, leaving a perfect glowing handprint, the contract was sealed. "She belongs to the crown now," Alaric announced. "Which means she belongs to me personally." Then he grabbed the silver chains and broke them. The chains snapped like dried twigs. Magic hissed out, dissipating into smoke that smelled of burnt promises. The breaking sounded like glass shattering. Everyone went absolutely still. Chains enchanted by the Seer Council weren't supposed to break through brute force. Alaric dropped broken pieces onto the altar. "The debt incurred by Nora Ashford and transferred to her daughter is hereby transferred to the crown, which means that debt now belongs to me to forgive. And I forgive it. Completely, irrevocably, immediately." Cassia's face went white. "Your Majesty, you cannot dissolve a blood debt." "I just did," Alaric interrupted. "If you have objections, file them with the Oversight Committee." He turned to Nora and held out his hand. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then let's go. We have work to do." Nora took his hand. His grip was warm despite blood loss. When he pulled her forward, enchantments parted like water. They walked toward doors together, and everyone watched with expressions of shock, fury, fear. Nora didn't look back. The king had purchased her contract, freed her debt, broken enchanted chains. And somewhere in 7 days, unless she found a way to cut fate's threads, this man was going to die violently. 6 days, 23 hours, 52 minutes until midnight, until blood on marble, until a crown in pieces. The carriage was modest black wood with silver trim. Alaric gestured for her to enter. Interior was dark velvet. He settled across from her and closed curtains. For minutes, neither spoke. "How long do I have?" Alaric said suddenly. Nora's gaze snapped up. "Until whatever you saw comes true. You're not subtle when visions hit. So tell me, how long until I die?" 7 days, Nora said quietly. "Based on what I saw. Cause of death? Violence. In the throne room. At midnight, I saw blood spreading. I saw something moving in shadows. Something that wasn't quite shadow. Wasn't quite solid." "Shadow magic," Alaric said. "You know what it is? Blood magic's darker cousin. Forbidden for 2 centuries, but practitioners exist. Can you see who's casting it?" "No. Visions show outcomes, not origins." "But your mother could." Nora went still. Alaric nodded. "I know about Nora Ashford, about what she could do. The council said she saw fixed futures, but that wasn't true. She could see threads connecting causes to effects. And sometimes she could cut those threads. How do you know?" "Because she saved my life when I was 16. I was supposed to die in a hunting accident. She saw it 3 days before, told me which path not to take. I lived. 2 weeks later, she was dead. The council couldn't let a seer who could alter fate stay alive." Nora's throat closed. She had been 12 when her mother died, young enough to believe the fever story, old enough to remember warnings. Don't let them see what you can really do. "Why bring me into the palace?" Nora asked. "If you know what happened to my mother, you're not safer, powerless. You're just easier to control. You're safer being powerful enough that the council has to think carefully before moving. And you're only powerful if someone gives you room to use it." He leaned forward. "I don't need a seer who tells me what's decided. I need someone who can see threads and tell me which can be cut. Because in 7 days, someone's trying to kill me. And I'd prefer not to die. And if I can't stop it, then we go down fighting. But I'd prefer we win." He held out his hand. "Deal? 7 days. You use your gift. I provide resources. We work as allies." Nora took his hand firmly. 7 days. But if you try binding me, I'm out." Alaric smiled. "Fair terms." His grip was warm, calloused. Outside, the city passed. Somewhere, someone was working shadow magic. Nora flexed her left hand, feeling the mark pulse. 7 days to see threads. 7 days to cut the right ones. The palace was colder than expected. Not temperature. Atmosphere. Servants moved quietly. Guards watched shadows. Alaric led her through winding halls to a tower. Spiral stairs climbed. The room was circular, with windows overlooking the city. Simple furnishing. Bed, washstand, desk. No locks. No chains. "This is yours," Alaric said. "Where are guards?" "Below. Not to keep you in, to keep others out." He gestured. "That's my room. If someone tries killing me, you'll hear. Practical, also trusting." "Rest," Alaric said. "We'll start tomorrow." "Wait," Nora said. "Why free my debt, really?" Alaric was quiet. "Because no one should be property. And because your mother gave me 10 extra years. If I can give you freedom, that's the least I can do." He left. Nora stood alone, 7 days pressing down. She moved to the window. Lights below. Ordinary lives. She unwrapped her palm. The crescent mark glowed faintly, pulsing with heartbeat. When she focused with the part of her mind that saw through present into future, threads appeared. Thousands of silver strands stretching everywhere. Most were thin, normal fates. But some were different, thick as rope, pulsing dark red, preventable deaths, and blazing brightest, stretching into Alaric's room, was a thread so dark it looked black. Her mother had taught her to see these. Some could be cut, some redirected, some would unravel everything. The trick was knowing which. "Show me," Nora whispered. "Show me if his death can be stopped." The thread pulsed, other threads branched, at each end, glimpses. A figure in white robes over dark books. A servant carrying something at midnight. A shadow detaching, sliding under doors. A knife casting no reflection. 4 visions, 4 paths, 4 chances. Nora pulled back, head aching, palm hot. But now she had something. 4 paths. 4 chances to cut the thread. She wrapped her hand and went to bed. Tomorrow was day 1. She needed sharpness. Day 1 began with a scream echoing through stone. Nora bolted up and ran. Guards were moving. She followed to the 2nd floor where a crowd gathered. Alaric stood in a doorway, expression granite. Nora pushed through. The body was a woman. Gray hair, throat opened ear to ear. But not just the wound. Shadows had left marks. Claw prints, burns, eyes open, terrified. "Lady Cordelia," Alaric said quietly. "Council advisor. She was testifying tomorrow about account irregularities." "Someone silenced her," Nora said. "Someone made an example." He turned to guards. "Clear the hall. Double rotations." When alone, Alaric asked, "Did you see this?" She shook her head. "I saw your death. Not hers. Threads only show what I'm looking for. Then they're escalating, killing witnesses." He looked back. "This is coordinated purge." What was she testifying about? Payments. Large sums through council accounts with no destination. She thought someone was funding illegal operations. He met her eyes. Shadow magic requires resources, ingredients, texts. Safe practice spaces. That costs money. Follow the money. Exactly. You investigate servants. I'll look at finances. They stood in the blood-stained hallway as morning light came. 5 days, suddenly more urgent. Day 2, Nora spent in servants' quarters learning how the palace really worked. These people knew everything. After earning trust, an older kitchen woman told her about Marcus. He's a steward, wine cellars, 20 years here. But 2 months ago, started looking wrong. Pale, shaky, and spending coin he shouldn't have. Bought his daughter expensive medicine. Nora found Marcus in cellars. Maybe 50, worn face. When he saw her, his expression cycled through fear, resignation, relief. "You're the seer the king brought." "I am." "Then you know." He set down a bottle. "I didn't want to. But they had my daughter. Said she'd die if I didn't help. She's 8. I couldn't let her die." Nora's throat tightened. "What did they make you do?" "Carry packages. From merchant district into palace. Never opened them. But I know they were using me to smuggle something dangerous past guards." "Who?" "Only met one person. Woman in white robes. Council robes. Ice eyes. She'd meet me behind 3 Ravens Tavern. Give me packages. Tell me where to leave them. Different places each time. Library. Gardens. Once in throne room itself." "Where was the last one?" Marcus's face crumpled. "Royal study. 3 days ago." She said it was the last. Said after this. "My debt was paid. I left it in the desk drawer. Haven't been able to sleep since." "Was it still there?" "Don't know. Haven't dared check. We need to check now." But Nora's palm flared hot. Whatever had been in that package was active. She took Marcus to Alaric, who listened without expression, then sent him away under guard for protection. "The royal study. Show me where threads lead." They went together with guards. Study was circular with garden windows. Simple furnishing. Nora pressed her marked palm to the desk. Threads blazed everywhere, wound around legs, wrapped through drawers, coiled around chair. A nest of dark red fate converging on one point. "There," she said, pointing to 3rd drawer. Alaric pulled it open carefully. Inside was a small wooden box, palm-sized, carved with symbols that hurt to look at. And it was vibrating. Slightly. As if something inside were breathing. "Don't open it," Nora said quickly. "Not here. Whatever's inside is active shadow magic, or about to become active. Then we take it somewhere it can't hurt anyone. Old dungeons, sealed for blood magic containment. If anywhere can hold this, those cells can." He looked at a guard. Get Soren and light magic reserves. We're going down." As the guard ran, Alaric turned to Nora. "You don't have to come. I'm coming. My threads led here. They'll lead further. And if something goes wrong, you'll need someone who can see what's coming." His expression softened. "For someone freed from debt 2 days ago, you're remarkably committed to risking your life for a king you barely know." "I'm not doing it for you," Nora said. "I'm doing it because I want to see if my mother was right, if threads really can be cut, if fate can be changed, and because in 5 days, if I don't figure this out, I'll watch you die. And I'd rather not." Something moved across Alaric's face. "Then let's go cut some threads." Days 3 and 4 passed intense investigation. They discovered the box contained a focus for shadow magic, designed to anchor a killing spell to a specific location. The throne room, midnight on the new moon. 5 days from now, the council was involved. High Seer Cassia herself had commissioned the shadow work through an exiled blood mage named Seer, who supposedly died 20 years ago but clearly hadn't. They found records hidden in Lady Cordelia's personal files that she'd died protecting. They traced payments through 3 different merchant houses, all leading back to council accounts Cassia controlled directly. They identified 4 other conspirators, all council members, all with reasons to want Alaric dead. He'd been investigating corruption, threatening to strip the council's traditional powers, planning reforms that would redistribute authority away from the old families who'd held it for generations. But they couldn't find Seer, couldn't locate where he was hiding, and they couldn't stop the shadow that was already cast, already moving through darkness toward the palace, growing stronger as the new moon approached. Day 5, 2 days left. Nora barely slept. The threads were tightening, pulling toward midnight like gravity, pulling toward the inevitable center. She could feel them constricting around Alaric's fate, see them growing darker and thicker with each passing hour. Alaric was everywhere at once, fortifying defenses, positioning guards with light magic training, learning counterspells from ancient texts, preparing the throne room with protective wards that might slow shadow magic, but probably wouldn't stop it completely. Day 6. 1 day left. The palace was on lockdown, every entrance guarded by multiple rotations, every shadow watched by soldiers with light-blessed weapons. Mages walked the halls in shifts, checking for dark magic incursions. But shadow magic didn't need doors or windows. It moved through darkness itself, flowing through the cracks between light and void that existed everywhere simultaneously. Nora stood in Alaric's study that evening, watching the threads converge. They all pointed to tomorrow. Midnight. The throne room. No matter what path she followed, no matter how many alternate futures she explored, they all ended in the same place. Blood on marble, a king dying, shadows consuming light. "I can't see a way to stop it," she admitted, her voice hollow with exhaustion and frustration. "Every path I follow leads to the same place, the same moment, the same death." "Then we don't try to stop it," Alaric said, his voice remarkably calm for a man discussing his own prophesied murder. "We control it. We choose the ground. We prepare every advantage we can think of. And when it comes, we're ready. Sometimes you can't avoid the battle. You can only decide how you meet it." Day 7. The final day. They spent it preparing with methodical precision. Alaric positioned guards throughout the throne room, each one trained in light magic and carrying weapons blessed by priests. Nora studied the threads obsessively, mapping every connection, every branch, every possible variation of how the moment could unfold. As evening fell, she realized something crucial. The threads didn't just show death as inevitable conclusion, they showed choices, moments where fate hinged on decisions not yet made. And the most important moment of choice was right before impact. The second when Alaric would turn toward the shadow. That split second was when the thread could be cut without unraveling everything around it. Midnight approached. They stood in the throne room, Alaric in position near the throne, Nora hidden in shadows with her marked palm glowing like a star beneath its cloth wrapping. Guards positioned around the perimeter with hands on weapons and lips moving in silent prayers to gods they hoped were listening. The bells began to ring throughout the city, deep bronze tolling that marked the hour. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 7 times the bells rang, and with the 7th ring, the shadows moved. something detached from the darkness pooling in the corners of the vast room, something that had been waiting there patiently for days, growing stronger as the moon waned toward nothing. It formed into a shape that was almost human but fundamentally wrong, proportions slightly off in ways that made the eye refuse to focus properly on it. Behind the shadow creature, a side door opened silently, and High Seer Cassia stepped through, her pristine white robes seeming to glow with their own internal light. Her hands moved in complex patterns, pulling invisible threads, directing shadow like a conductor, directing an orchestra toward its crescendo. "You should have died 6 times by now," Cassia said, her voice carrying easily across the marble expanse despite speaking at normal volume. "But you're clever and stubborn and protected by seers who see too clearly. Either way, it ends tonight. You can't fight what you can't touch. You can't kill what's already dead." "It does end tonight," Alaric agreed, his hand steady on his sword. "Just not the way you think." That's when Nora moved, stepping out of her concealment with purpose burning in every muscle. She had practiced this moment for 6 days, visualizing it, understanding it, learning to see not just threads but the exact points where threads could be cut without unraveling everything connected to them, without creating cascading failures that would be worse than the original fate. Her mother had done it instinctively, feeling her way through probability fields with natural talent refined by desperation. Nora had to think about it, calculate carefully, choose with precision. But she could do it. She would do it. She would not watch another person she cared about die when she had the power to prevent it. She reached out with her gift, seeing through the physical world into the web of cause and effect that underlay everything. The thread connecting Cassia to her shadow spell blazed in her prophetic vision like burning rope, thick as her wrist, pulsing with dark power that tasted like copper and smelled like burning flesh, and hummed with the resonance of ancient forbidden magic that should have stayed buried with its creators. And it was cuttable. The thread had a weak point, a place where Cassia's control wavered slightly, where the connection between caster and cast frayed just enough that a skilled seer with the right gift could sever it completely if they were brave enough to try and fast enough to succeed before the backlash killed them both. Nora pulled with everything she had, reaching through dimensions with her marked palm burning like a brand, grabbing that thread with mental hands that shouldn't exist but did because her mother had shown her how to make them, and she yanked with all her will, focused into a single point of absolute intention. The thread snapped with a sound like reality tearing along invisible seams. The shadow creature screamed, a sound that no human throat could produce, and dissolved instantly back into component darkness that spread harmlessly across marble floor. Cassia stumbled as if struck, her spell breaking catastrophically, magical backlash hitting her like a physical wave. She fell to her knees, gasping, blood running from her nose and ears from the sudden, violent severance of connection between her will and her working. Alaric moved with the fluid speed of someone who'd spent his entire life training for exactly this kind of moment. One smooth motion, sword drawn and leveled, placing the blade point precisely at Cassia's throat, where the slightest pressure would open arteries. "You're finished," he said quietly. "Guards, take her." Soldiers poured in from side entrances as if they'd been waiting for precisely this signal. They bound Cassia's hands with chains specifically designed to prevent magical working, chains that looked remarkably similar to the ones Alaric had broken several days ago in the council chamber. As they dragged her away, still gasping and bleeding and making incoherent sounds that might have been curses or pleas or simply the sounds of someone whose entire reality had just shattered around them, Alaric turned to Nora. "You did it," he said, and there was something in his voice she'd never heard before. Relief, gratitude, wonder. "You actually cut the thread. You changed fate." "We did it," Nora corrected, because it was important that he understand this. "It wasn't just me. You trusted me enough to let me try. You gave me the freedom and resources to learn how to do this. You positioned guards perfectly so nothing could interfere. This was partnership, not solo heroics from either of us. Because that's what they'd been for 7 days. Not king and seer, not master and servant, not owner and property. Partners, allies. 2 people who had decided that fate could be changed if you were willing to fight for it. If you were willing to risk everything on the possibility that the future wasn't fixed, that prophecy showed probability rather than inevitability, that threads could be cut by seers brave enough and skilled enough to try. Nora looked down at her left palm. The mark was still glowing, but calmer now, steady pulsing instead of frantic burning. The light seemed somehow warmer, less painful, as if the mark itself was satisfied with what she'd accomplished. "I can teach others," she said, the realization forming as she spoke it. "Other seers with marks like mine, marks that show them threads of fate. I can teach them to see clearly and cut the threads that need cutting. Show them how to change futures without destroying everything around them. Make sure the gift my mother had doesn't die with her, doesn't get lost because the council was too afraid of seers who could actually change what they saw." Alaric smiled, the first genuinely warm smile she'd seen from him in all their time together. It transformed his severe features completely, making him look younger and more human and considerably less intimidating. "Then, let's do exactly that. 7 days ago, I was supposed to die according to absolute prophecy. Instead, I'm standing here alive and planning to rebuild the entire kingdom's approach to prophetic magic and seer training. If that's not proof that fate can be changed, I don't know what would be." "Just don't make me attend too many formal council meetings," Nora said. Because if they were going to be partners in truth, she needed to establish boundaries early. "I saved your life. That should earn me permanent exemption from bureaucratic torture disguised as governance." "Noted and agreed," Alaric said, his smile widening. "Though I reserve the right to occasionally ask your opinion on matters where prophetic insight might prevent wars or famines or other large-scale disasters that would be considerably more unpleasant than sitting through boring administrative proceedings." "That seems fair," Nora allowed. He held out his hand. "Not a king to a subject, not an owner to property, just one person to another, equals offering partnership." Nora took it firmly, feeling the calluses from sword training, the warmth of living flesh, the steady pulse that proved prophecy had been wrong, that fate could be changed, that the future was malleable if you were brave enough to cut the threads connecting present to unwanted outcomes. And somewhere in the city far below the palace towers, dawn was breaking across rooftops and chimneys and market squares. The first light of day touching the first day of a future they'd cut free from fate's original pattern, a future that hadn't existed 7 days ago. A future they would have to build themselves, one choice at a time, one cut thread at a time, one prevented disaster at a time. Together. The aftermath of that midnight confrontation rippled through the palace and beyond like waves spreading from a stone dropped in still water. By morning, news of Cassia's arrest and the failed assassination had spread throughout the city, carried by servants and guards and midnight witnesses who'd watched through cracked doors and heard through thin walls. Thanks for watching. By afternoon, 3 other council members had fled the kingdom entirely, abandoning their positions and considerable fortunes in their haste to escape prosecution. By evening, the remaining council had formally requested an emergency session to discuss restructuring their authority and oversight procedures, a request Alaric granted with satisfaction barely concealed behind diplomatic neutrality. Nora spent the first day after the confrontation sleeping for 16 consecutive hours, her body finally demanding payment for 6 days of minimal rest and constant prophetic strain. When she woke, it was to find Alaric had posted guards outside her door not to confine her, but to ensure no one disturbed her recovery, and had arranged for meals to be brought whenever she was ready to eat rather than forcing her to navigate formal dining schedules designed around royal convenience rather than human necessity. The second day, she began the actual work of documenting what she'd learned about thread cutting, writing detailed notes about how to see the weak points in fate's weaving, how to distinguish threads that could be safely severed from those that would cause cascading failures if touched. It was painstaking work, trying to put into words something she understood primarily through intuition and practice, like trying to explain the precise muscle movements required for walking to someone who'd never used their legs before. But it was necessary work. If she was going to teach this skill to others, she needed a framework, a systematic approach, something more reliable than feel for it and hope you're right. The third day, Alaric brought her the first candidate, a young seer named Denna, maybe 19, who'd been bound to a minor noble house for 4 years and had developed the same crescent mark on her palm that Nora carried. The noble family had been exploiting her gift to maintain their gambling profits until Alaric's recent reforms had created opportunities for contract reviews and appeals. Denna was shy, traumatized from years of abuse disguised as legal service, but her eyes lit with desperate hope when Nora showed her the threads connecting present actions to future outcomes. When she demonstrated cutting a minor thread connecting a servant's carelessness to a dropped tray that would have shattered expensive glassware. "I can do that?" Denna whispered, watching the thread dissolve into mist. "I can change things?" "You can learn," Nora confirmed. "It takes practice and patience and a willingness to make mistakes while you're learning. But yes, you can learn to change things." By the end of the week, 3 more seers had arrived at the palace, each one carrying the mark, each one desperate to learn whether their gift was curse or blessing, whether they were doomed to watch disasters unfold or whether they might possess the power to prevent them. Nora started each session the same way her mother had started hers, by helping them see the threads first, then understand the threads, then finally touch them with prophetic awareness that operated beyond normal sensory perception. Alaric watched these training sessions when his schedule permitted, standing in doorways or sitting in corners with his constant paperwork, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated he was paying closer attention than his divided focus suggested. He was learning alongside them, Nora realized. Not to see threads himself, he didn't have the gift for that, but to understand how prophetic magic worked, what its limitations were, what kinds of support seers needed to use their abilities safely and effectively. "You're different than I expected," Nora told him one evening when the last student had left and they were alone in the practice room with candles burning low. "When I heard the crown wanted my contract, I expected someone who'd use me until I broke. Someone who saw seers as tools rather than people. I was raised by someone who saw everyone as tools," Alaric said quietly. "My father. He measured human value exclusively in terms of immediate utility to his goals. It made him an effective administrator and a terrible person. I decided very young that I wanted to be neither, that I'd rather be a moderately competent king who treated people with basic dignity than a brilliantly successful tyrant who sacrificed others to his ambitions." He looked at her directly. "Your mother showed me that prophecy doesn't have to mean passive observation, that seers aren't just messengers delivering bad news from the future, that you can see what's coming and still fight to change it. I've been trying to apply that lesson to everything since." "She would have liked you," Nora said. "My mother. She would have liked knowing that her death accomplished something, that it protected someone who'd eventually be in position to protect others." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the candles burn. Outside, the city sprawled in evening light, thousands of lives unfolding in threads Nora could see if she looked but didn't need to monitor constantly anymore. She was learning to rest her gift, to let it sleep when not needed, rather than maintaining constant vigilant watching that had been necessary during the 7 days when everything hung on catching the right warning signs at the right moments. "What happens next?" she asked eventually. "After we finish training, the seers who are here now, after the council is properly restructured, after the immediate crisis is past, we keep going," Alaric said simply. "We find more seers who need training. We continue reforming laws that make people property. We work on making the kingdom somewhere that values people for who they are rather than exclusively for what they can do. It's not dramatic work. It's mostly paperwork and committee meetings and patient negotiation with people who resist change, because change threatens their comfort. But it matters." "I can work with that," Nora said, "as long as the committee meetings aren't too boring." "I make no promises about the meetings," Alaric said, smiling, "but I can promise they'll matter." And somehow that was enough. More than enough. To have work that mattered. To have freedom to choose that work. To have a partner who understood that changing the world required both dramatic midnight confrontations with shadow magic and tedious afternoon sessions reviewing contract law, both cutting threads of fate and filing the proper paperwork to ensure those changes held under legal scrutiny. 7 days ago, Nora had been property bound by chains and debt. Now she was free, training others to be free, working to reshape laws that had kept her and countless others trapped. 7 days ago, Alaric had been waiting to die. Now he was alive, planning years of reforms, building something that might outlast them both. The future they'd cut free from fate's original patterns stretched ahead, uncertain and full of possibility. And for the first time in longer than Nora could remember, that uncertainty felt like opportunity rather than threat, like hope rather than dread, like a story they would write themselves rather than one already written in prophecy's inevitable ink.